In my experience, there are two kinds of conferences. There are those that are adjourned and there are those that are behind schedule. We are one of the latter. So it is the obligation of this panel to try to get us back on schedule because we stand between you and lunch. Not only between you and lunch, but you and Ambassador Ron Dermer, who will be honored at lunch. So we will endeavor to put our panel back on schedule and share some reflections, as Richard said. First, more historical from my side about Louis D. Brandeis and his role in the Balfour Declaration. But I do think there's a contemporary aspect to this because there is a sense of Brandeis very much as a modern American Jew who lived in both worlds and identified deeply in both worlds. And then my colleagues on the panel, Robert Satloff and Herb London, will add reflections that will take us up to the present period. Long before I could have imagined becoming president of Brandeis University, Louis Brandeis was a personal hero of mine. I suspect he was a personal hero of many of you in this room. Brandeis had 4 different careers, any one of which he would be famous for today. First, and perhaps by some measures foremost, he was a lawyer extraordinaire, not just a very successful one, but one who redefined the practice of law. That's worthy of an entire lecture by itself, but I'll just mention the fact that he invented an entirely new way of arguing before the United States Supreme Court, the so-called Brandeis brief, that is now taken as a given using sociological data before the Supreme Court. Nobody had done that before Brandeis. And he re-envisioned the whole idea of what it meant to be a lawyer. He created the idea of what he called lawyer for the situation. He created pro bono practice before it existed. So if he'd done only that, he would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary American Jewish lawyers. But he didn't do only that. His second life, his second career, was as an extraordinary scholar. He, in probably the most influential law review article ever written, along with his co-author, created the right of privacy, which we now take as a given, and some think it should be broader, some think it should be narrower. Nobody denies that there's a right of privacy in our society, whatever that means. Brandeis sort of created that. Third, obviously, he had an extraordinary career on the Supreme Court and is the first Jewish American to serve on the United States Supreme Court. And if you want to know how significant that was, when you find yourself at 1606 New Hampshire Avenue, that's where my office is, I got a picture of the court that is taken either in 1922 or 1924, as an annoying teacher of mine used to say, ask me a question. Why not 1923? Because there was no court portrait taken in 1923 because James McReynolds was such a vicious anti-Semite that Justice McReynolds refused to be photographed with Justice Brandeis, except when Chief Justice Taft forced him to do so. And if you look at the picture, you'll see McReynolds is looking off to the side. He doesn't want to look at Brandeis. And when I tell this story, I always ask the following question. Who in the room has ever heard of James McReynolds? How many in the room have ever heard of Louis Brandeis? And the real punchline is that the one person who's heard of James McReynolds, what do you know about him? You know he was a vicious anti-Semite. That's the one thing he's remembered for. So Louis Brandeis was an extraordinary figure on the Supreme Court. But then fourth, and what we want to focus on today, is that he was, in fact, a significant, perhaps at the time, the significant leader of the American Zionist movement. It is impossible to overstate the significant role that he played and when he dedicated himself to the Zionist cause. Among other things, he, better than anyone, could argue against the shibboleth of dual loyalties that Zionists were suspected of. Is your loyalty to your people, is your loyalty to the United States? Brandeis famously said that to be good Americans, we must be better Jews, and to be better Jews, we must all become Zionists. He said that in 1915. I'm going to say it again slowly, because I think it's a creed we might all take on. To be good Americans, we must be better Jews, and to be better Jews, we must all be Zionists. It's also hard to overstate the courage that he showed at the time, because at the time he became involved in the movement, he had to know there was a possibility that President Wilson would put him on the Supreme Court, and he had to know he was putting himself in harm's way by taking on a cause that at the time was not only not popular, in some cases it was outright negative. So I mention this as a historical story, but I say it for the current residents. The moral courage to say what he believed, to advocate what he believed, not being concerned the consequences that he might face. The early Zionists in America were anxious to recruit Brandeis to their movement. Obviously, he could bring a lot of firepower to it. He was slow to the movement because he chose his causes carefully. In 1912, when he campaigned for Woodrow Wilson all over the country, synagogues all over the country would invite him to sit on the bima. It was considered a great get to get Louis Brandeis. He wrote to his brother Alfred, they're asking me to sit on the bima all over the country, so you see I am making headway in Judaism. Brandeis is not what you would call a frum guy. There's a story told of his sister briefly dating an Orthodox fellow who took her to an Orthodox synagogue on Yom Kippur. Brandeis' father said that he should go collect his sister at the end of the service and bring her home. He was surprised it was so easy to get his horse and carriage up to the front of the synagogue. There was so little traffic in front of that shul on Yom Kippur. So Brandeis was slow to the knowledge on this, and yet we know an interesting thing about him. He spent time in his Uncle Dembitz's home, who was Shomer Shabbat, and he writes about the feel in the home on Shabbat and what it meant to him. Louis Dembitz Brandeis was not born Louis Dembitz Brandeis. It was Louis David Brandeis. He changed it from David to Dembitz, showing a deep connection that he had to his Uncle Dembitz. He did pay the mandatory shekel to belong to the Federation of American Zionists, but he resisted a major role in the movement, even though they tried to recruit him. But it caught his interest. In 1912, at an event hosted by Julius Rosenwald in Chicago, he met the young Aaron Aronson, a young Zionist very involved in making the land bloom. And Brandeis, who chose his words carefully and was not exactly an evocative or emotional guy, wrote the following to his brother. It was the most thrillingly interesting talk I have ever heard, showing the possibilities of scientific agriculture and utilization of arid or supposedly exhausted land. He did attend a major rally in Boston where he introduced a major Zionist leader, and then shortly thereafter did not attend the WZO meeting. So the Zionist movement was having a hard time recruiting him, and then something extraordinary happened within the first month of World War I. The end of August of 1914, when the Zionist movement, which at the time, the World Zionist Organization, was based in Berlin. Berlin in 1914 was now a combatant, and the movement had people who were spread all over the world and on all sides of different political issues and divides. So the movement was in tatters. They convened a famous meeting at the Hotel Marseille in New York on the 30th of August. Brandeis was to chair the meeting, and ostensibly they thought he would be a figurehead, and they thought he would give some money, and they thought he'd sort of give some luster to it. And he was enthralled. And he kept all of the leaders, many of whom were European, many of whom, unlike him, were not Harvard educated. He kept them there for 2 straight days, absorbing everything he could about the Zionist movement. And it was, choosing my words carefully, it was a conversion movement for him. And he became a lifelong Zionist thereafter. What drew him? There are a number of different theories as to what particularly drew him. There are those who say that this was his chance to identify with his people. Maybe that was a risky move. Melvin Urofsky, the famous biographer of Brandeis, said that he actually saw the synthesis of America and the Zionist movement here. That whereas America was a place that for him had become obsessed with big business, and he was a trust buster, he was anti-big business, and he saw that the land of Israel could be a place for the creation of a new Jewish Jeffersonian or Jacksonian kind of state. So I think that's a piece of it, that it appealed to him as a reform movement. But it's more than that. There was a piece to him that struck him in a deep and emotional way. And people around Brandeis said that they had never seen him react to something quite as emotionally as he did to Zionism. But for all of the emotion, he brought structure to the movement. His motto was men, money, and discipline, which was a movement that was lacking in money, lacking in person power, and certainly lacking in discipline. We might say, instead of men, money, discipline, we might say people, resources, and organization, or perhaps Richard Heidemann might say leadership, vision, and unity, as he has for this conference. And in this was packed in both the challenges and the promise that would be Brandeis and Zionism. The challenge that he, in some ways, would always be sideways of some of the other leaders who didn't quite get his organization, and in 1921 he would split from Weizmann and the European-based Zionist movement. But at the same time, he saw the way in which religious and non-religious could work together. He saw that more established American Jews like himself and his family could work with the new immigrants. And most of all, he could see how he could lose himself in a cause that was greater than himself. Shortly after the Balfour Declaration was issued, Allenby captured Jerusalem and the land of Israel at long last. And Brandeis received a congratulatory message from his mother-in-law, Regina Goldmore. Here's what he wrote back to her. The work of Zionism has seemed to me, on the whole, the most worthwhile of all I have ever attempted, and it is with great satisfaction to see the world gradually acquiescing in its realization. Sadly, the word gradual was probably the most significant word there. Nonetheless, that was what he understood. So let me briefly add a few thoughts about how he then plays a role in Balfour particularly. April of 1917, two things happened. The United States goes into World War I, which means now we're combatants. But Balfour meets Brandeis here in Washington, D.C. And perhaps surprisingly, they immediately hit it off. Politically, they were on very opposite sides of the spectrum. But I think they understood each other to be involved in something very significant. And Balfour understood that Brandeis could be the go-between with Wilson. And he was. In a way, by the way, the Supreme Court justices would never do today. He was already on the Supreme Court. But he was the one who could walk the tightrope with Wilson. What do I mean by the tightrope? Don't forget, Wilson had to be persuaded that Zionism was not colonialism, which he had been dead set against in the 14 Principles. Does that have a current feel to it? Right? Zionism was not colonialism. What was it? It was a movement of self-determination. Wilson believed in self-determination. He was anti-imperialistic. So what Brandeis was able to persuade Wilson is very much the same issue taking place on American college campuses today. And that he understood that was the role he had to play. He played a very significant role getting Wilson to agree in May of 1917 to the basic principles of Balfour. And as Wilson began to waver over the summer of 1917, it was Brandeis again who played a constructive role. And then finally, as we get near November, it is Brandeis who plays the pivotal role in meeting with Colonel House, what we would today say was the President's Chief of Staff, or sort of a consigliere. He worked with Colonel House as a back channel to Wilson to bring Wilson on. Brandeis parted from the movement in 1921, but he remained a lifelong Zionist. And let me end with what he said on his first visit to Eretz Yisrael in 1919. You gotta remember what the land looked like in 1919. You gotta remember who Louis Brandeis was. He was a Boston Brahmin. He was educated in Germany. He was a United States Supreme Court Justice. To say the least, you couldn't get a good hotel room in Jerusalem in 1919. Here's what he wrote. The way is long. The path is difficult and uncertain, but the struggle is worthwhile. It is indeed a holy land. Thank you.